Rabbi David Goldstein was finishing his evening prayers when the desperate knocking began at the synagogue's side door. The sounds echoed through the empty sanctuary like gunshots, urgent and afraid. It was past 11 on a Tuesday night, and the streets of the quiet suburban neighborhood were empty, except for the occasional passing car. Rabbi Goldstein hesitated for a moment. Late-night visits to the synagogue were unusual and potentially dangerous, but something about the frantic quality of the knocking compelled him to respond. When he opened the heavy wooden door, he found a woman collapsed against the frame, her face swollen and bloodied, her clothes torn and dirty. She couldn't have been more than 30 years old, with dark hair matted with blood and eyes that darted nervously between his face and the dark street behind her. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible through split lips. "I need help. I have nowhere else to go." Rabbi Goldstein didn't hesitate. He had dedicated his life to serving others, to being a refuge for those in need, and this woman's desperation spoke to every principle he held sacred. He gently helped her inside, supporting her weight as she struggled to walk, and led her to his office behind the sanctuary. The fluorescent lights revealed the full extent of her injuries. Fresh bruises covered her arms and neck. Her left eye was swollen shut, and her hands shook uncontrollably. She identified herself as Sarah Martinez, and through halting sentences punctuated by tears, she explained that her husband had beaten her worse than ever before. She had managed to escape while he was passed out drunk, but she had no money, no car, and no family nearby who could help her. The synagogue was the only building with lights still on, the only place that looked like it might offer sanctuary. Rabbi Goldstein knew immediately that his life was about to become much more complicated, but looking at Sarah's battered face, he also knew there was no other choice he could make. Rabbi Goldstein made the decision that would change everything without consulting anyone else. He called his wife Rachel at home, explaining the situation in quiet tones, while Sarah sat in his office, wrapped in a blanket from the synagogue's emergency supply. Rachel, a nurse who had seen her share of domestic violence cases, didn't hesitate to support her husband's decision to help. "Bring her home," she said simply. "We have the spare room, and she needs medical attention." They drove Sarah to their modest house a few blocks from the synagogue, where Rachel immediately began tending to her injuries with the efficiency of a medical professional. Sarah flinched at every touch, her body conditioned to expect pain, but gradually began to relax as she realized these people meant her no harm. Over the next several hours, as Rachel cleaned wounds and applied ice to bruises, the full story emerged. Sarah had been married to Miguel Martinez for 3 years, during which time the abuse had escalated from occasional slaps to regular beatings. Miguel was a respected contractor in the community, with a quick temper and a drinking problem that everyone ignored because he was charming and successful when sober. Sarah had tried to leave twice before, but Miguel had tracked her down both times, convincing her to return with promises to change that lasted only weeks. This time was different. He had threatened to kill her, and she believed he meant it. She had no savings of her own, no job skills that would allow her to support herself, and no family who understood the depth of her situation. Rabbi Goldstein and Rachel sat in their kitchen at 3 in the morning, discussing what to do next. They both knew that taking Sarah in was only the beginning of a much larger commitment, one that would test their faith, their marriage, and their standing in the community. But they also knew that turning away someone in desperate need would violate everything they believed about their responsibility to others. Over the next few days, as Sarah's physical wounds began to heal, Rabbi Goldstein faced the reality of what he had committed to. Sarah had nowhere else to go. Women's shelters in the area had waiting lists, and she was terrified that Miguel would find her at any official facility. She begged to stay just a few more days, just until she could figure out what to do next. But Rabbi Goldstein could see that she had no realistic plan for independence. Miguel had isolated her from friends and family, controlled all their finances, and systematically destroyed her self-confidence over 3 years of abuse. She needed more than just temporary shelter. She needed time to heal emotionally and practically rebuild her life. Rabbi Goldstein made the decision to let her stay indefinitely, using the small apartment above the synagogue that had traditionally housed visiting rabbinical students. The space was simple but private, with a kitchenette and bathroom that would allow Sarah to maintain some independence while still being close to help if she needed it. Rachel helped Sarah settle into the space, providing clothes, food, and the emotional support of another woman who understood the trauma she had endured. The arrangement felt natural and right to the rabbi and his wife. Their faith taught them to welcome strangers and care for the vulnerable, and Sarah's presence gave them a concrete way to live out those beliefs. But Rabbi Goldstein also knew he would eventually have to explain the situation to his congregation, particularly to the synagogue's board of directors, who had ultimate authority over how the building was used. He hoped they would understand and support his decision, but he had been a rabbi long enough to know that communities don't always respond to moral challenges the way their religious teachings suggest they should. For now, though, he was content to focus on Sarah's immediate needs and trust that the right path would become clear as the situation developed. Word of Sarah's presence spread through the synagogue community with the speed that gossip travels in tight-knit religious congregations. It started innocently enough. Mrs. Rosen saw lights in the upstairs apartment and mentioned it to her friend, Mrs. Cohen, who mentioned it to her daughter, who mentioned it to her husband on the board of directors. Within a week, everyone knew that Rabbi Goldstein was housing a non-Jewish woman who had left her husband, though the details became increasingly distorted with each retelling. Some versions of the story portrayed Sarah as a manipulative woman who had seduced the rabbi into helping her. Others suggested she was a criminal fleeing justice rather than a victim fleeing abuse. Rabbi Goldstein tried to control the narrative by addressing the situation directly during his Friday night sermon, explaining that the synagogue was providing temporary shelter to a woman escaping domestic violence, and that this action reflected their community's commitment to the Jewish principle of tikkun olam, repairing the world. He spoke about the biblical commandment to welcome strangers and protect the vulnerable, reminding his congregation that their ancestors had been strangers in Egypt and knew the importance of showing compassion to those in need. But his words fell on increasingly skeptical ears. Board member Harold Weinstein approached him after services with barely concealed anger. "Rabbi, this is highly inappropriate. You can't just move random people into synagogue property without consulting the board. What if she steals something? What if her husband comes looking for her and creates a dangerous situation? You've put our entire community at risk." Other congregants expressed similar concerns, though most were too polite to confront the rabbi directly. Instead, they whispered among themselves about the impropriety of the situation, the potential legal liability, and the precedent it might set for future requests for help. Some questioned whether a non-Jewish woman deserved their community's resources, while others worried about how the situation reflected on their synagogue's reputation in the broader community. The emergency board meeting was called for the following Tuesday evening, and Rabbi Goldstein knew it would be one of the most difficult conversations of his rabbinical career. The synagogue's conference room felt smaller than usual as 8 board members filed in, their faces ranging from concerned to openly hostile. Harold Weinstein, the board president, had clearly been organizing opposition to the rabbi's decision, and his opening statement made it clear that this was not going to be a friendly discussion. "Rabbi Goldstein," he began formally, "the board has serious concerns about your unilateral decision to house a non-congregant in synagogue property. This action was taken without consultation, without proper screening, and without consideration of the potential consequences for our community." Rabbi Goldstein had prepared for this moment, but he still felt the weight of isolation as he faced the 8 people who had the power to override his decisions and potentially end his tenure at the synagogue. "I understand your concerns," he replied calmly, "but I want you to consider what we would be saying about ourselves as a community if we turned away someone in desperate need. Sarah Martinez was beaten nearly to death by her husband. She came to us because our building was the only place with lights on, the only place that looked like it might offer help." Board member Jennifer Gold, usually one of the rabbi's supporters, shook her head. "Rabbi, we sympathize with this woman's situation, but our responsibility is to our own community first. We have insurance concerns, security issues, and the simple fact that you made a major decision about synagogue property without consulting us." The debate continued for over 2 hours, with Rabbi Goldstein defending his actions while the board outlined their practical and legal concerns. Some worried about setting a precedent that would bring a stream of people seeking help. Others questioned the appropriateness of a male rabbi housing a young woman. And still others simply felt that the synagogue's resources should be reserved for Jewish families in need. As the evening wore on, it became clear that the majority of the board wanted Sarah removed from the premises as soon as possible. Block 6. The Ultimatum. By the end of the board meeting, the lines had been clearly drawn. Harold Weinstein presented Rabbi Goldstein with what amounted to an ultimatum. Sarah Martinez must be gone within 2 weeks, or the board would consider it a violation of his contract and grounds for termination. "Rabbi," Weinstein said with the tone of someone delivering a final warning, "we respect your compassion, but your primary obligation is to this congregation and its members. You cannot continue to make unilateral decisions that affect our entire community." Rabbi Goldstein felt the weight of 15 years of service to this congregation, 15 years of building relationships and guiding families through life's milestones. He had officiated at Harold Weinstein's daughter's wedding, had comforted Jennifer Gold when her mother died, had counseled half the board members through personal crises. Yet now they were asking him to choose between his job and his conscience, between institutional loyalty and moral obligation. The drive home that night was the longest of Rabbi Goldstein's life. He sat in his car in the driveway for 20 minutes, knowing that when he walked inside, he would have to explain to his wife that his career might be ending, and to Sarah that her safe haven was being taken away. Rachel was waiting in the kitchen when he finally came in, and one look at his face told her everything she needed to know. "They want her gone," she said quietly. Rabbi Goldstein nodded, unable to trust his voice. They talked until dawn about their options, finding another placement for Sarah, fighting the board's decision, or accepting defeat and asking Sarah to leave. But every conversation came back to the same impossible choice: abandon their principles or risk everything they had built together. When Sarah came downstairs for breakfast the next morning, looking healthier and more confident than she had since arriving, Rabbi Goldstein couldn't bring himself to tell her that her time of safety was limited. Instead, he decided to fight for what he believed was right, regardless of the consequences. Block 7. The Community Divides. Rabbi Goldstein's decision to defy the board's ultimatum split the congregation down the middle, creating factions that reflected deeper philosophical divisions about the synagogue's role in the community. Younger members, many of whom had been drawn to the synagogue by Rabbi Goldstein's progressive interpretations of Jewish law and emphasis on social justice, rallied to support him. They organized meetings, wrote letters to the board, and began a petition supporting the rabbi's right to make moral decisions without board oversight. "This is exactly what our faith calls us to do," argued Sarah Brenner, a 35-year-old lawyer who had joined the congregation 5 years earlier. "We're supposed to be a light unto the nations, not a closed circle that only takes care of its own." But older, more established members of the congregation saw the situation differently. They had invested decades in building the synagogue into a stable, respected institution, and they feared that Rabbi Goldstein's actions threatened everything they had worked to create. "We support helping people in need," explained longtime member Ruth Lieberman, "but there are proper channels for charity work. The rabbi has overstepped his authority and put our entire congregation at risk." The division became increasingly bitter as both sides dug in. Board meetings became contentious affairs with packed attendance, as supporters and opponents of the rabbi's actions faced off in what felt more like political rallies than religious discussions. Some families stopped coming to services altogether, while others attended specifically to show their support for either the rabbi or the board. The local Jewish newspaper picked up the story, and suddenly Temple Beth Shalom was receiving national attention for all the wrong reasons. Social media amplified the conflict, with people who had never heard of the synagogue weighing in on the appropriateness of Rabbi Goldstein's actions. The stress was taking its toll on everyone involved, but especially on Rabbi Goldstein himself, who had never imagined that an act of compassion would tear apart the community he loved. Block 8. Sarah's response. As the controversy swirled around her, Sarah Martinez found herself in an impossible position. She was grateful for the sanctuary Rabbi Goldstein had provided, but she was also horrified that her presence was destroying the community that had saved her life. She had been attending evening classes to get her GED, working with a counselor to process her trauma, and slowly rebuilding her sense of self-worth. All progress that would be endangered if she was forced to leave. But she also couldn't bear the thought that her presence was causing so much pain for people who had shown her nothing but kindness. One evening, as protesters gathered outside the synagogue demanding either her removal or the board's resignation, Sarah made her way to Rabbi Goldstein's office to offer the sacrifice she hoped might end the conflict. "Rabbi," she said quietly, "I should leave. I never wanted to cause trouble for you or your family or your congregation. Maybe if I go, things can go back to normal." Rabbi Goldstein looked at this woman, who had transformed from a broken victim into someone beginning to reclaim her strength, and he felt a surge of protective anger. "Sarah, you have done nothing wrong. You asked for help, and we gave it. The problem isn't with you. It's with people who have forgotten what our faith actually teaches us." But Sarah persisted, explaining that she had been researching other options and had found a women's shelter in a neighboring city that might have space for her. She had also been in touch with a legal aid organization that could help her with divorce proceedings and possibly job training. It wasn't ideal, but it was a path forward that wouldn't require the rabbi to sacrifice his career. Rabbi Goldstein realized that Sarah was offering him an easy way out of the crisis, a solution that would allow him to claim victory while avoiding the ultimate confrontation with his board. But accepting her offer would mean abandoning the principles that had led him to help her in the first place, and it would send a message to his congregation about what really mattered when faith and convenience came into conflict. Block 9. The final confrontation. The showdown came at the synagogue's annual meeting, where the entire congregation gathered to hear both sides present their cases and to vote on Rabbi Goldstein's future. The sanctuary was packed beyond capacity, with folding chairs lining the aisles and people standing along the walls. Local media had been invited, and the tension in the room was palpable as Harold Weinstein rose to present the board's position. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to being heard, "we are here today because our rabbi has forgotten that his primary obligation is to this congregation and its members. His decision to house a non-Jewish woman in our building, without consultation or proper safeguards, has created division, controversy, and potential legal liability that threatens everything we have built together." Weinstein outlined the board's concerns methodically: the lack of proper screening procedures, the potential for precedent setting that could overwhelm the synagogue with requests for help, the insurance and security risks, and the fundamental question of whether synagogue resources should be used for non-congregants. He concluded by calling for a vote of no confidence in Rabbi Goldstein's leadership unless he agreed to abide by board decisions in the future. When Rabbi Goldstein rose to respond, the sanctuary fell completely silent. He had prepared remarks, but looking out at the faces of people he had served for 15 years, people whose children he had blessed, whose loved ones he had buried, whose spiritual crises he had guided them through, he set aside his notes and spoke from the heart. 15 years ago, you called me to be your rabbi, not just to lead services and teach Torah, but to help you live as Jews in the modern world, he began. Today you are asking me to choose between institutional loyalty and moral obligation, between preserving our comfort and living our values. He spoke about the Jewish experience of exile and persecution, about the commandments to welcome strangers and protect the vulnerable, about the responsibility of religious communities to be sanctuaries for those in need. He acknowledged the board's practical concerns, but argued that some decisions transcended practical considerations and required moral courage. Block 10. The vote and its aftermath. The vote was closer than anyone had expected. 52% of the congregation supported Rabbi Goldstein's right to make moral decisions without board approval, while 48% sided with the board's call for institutional discipline. It was a victory for the rabbi, but one that felt more like a defeat given how deeply the community had been divided. In the weeks that followed, nearly 30 families left the congregation, including several major donors whose departure threatened the synagogue's financial stability. Harold Weinstein resigned from the board in protest, taking with him decades of institutional knowledge and financial support. The local Jewish community was split in its response to the controversy, with some synagogues expressing support for Rabbi Goldstein's stance, while others quietly distanced themselves from what they saw as a reckless precedent. Sarah Martinez, who had watched the proceedings from the back of the sanctuary, was deeply moved by the congregation's willingness to fight for her right to sanctuary. But she was also realistic about the costs that decision had imposed on the community. She announced her decision to accept placement at the women's shelter, not because she was being forced to leave, but because she wanted to begin the next phase of her recovery in an environment that wasn't overshadowed by controversy. Rabbi Goldstein helped her move to the shelter, where she would have access to job training, legal assistance, and counseling services that would help her build an independent life. As they packed her few belongings, Sarah thanked the rabbi for saving her life. But she also expressed her hope that someday the congregation would heal from the wounds that her presence had opened. The apartment above the synagogue stood empty again, but it had been forever changed by the woman who had lived there and the crisis her presence had precipitated. Rabbi Goldstein remained at Temple Beth Shalom, but his relationship with his congregation was fundamentally altered, marked by both the trust of those who had supported him and the lingering resentment of those who felt he had betrayed their confidence. Block 11. Lessons learned. A year later, as Rabbi Goldstein reflected on the events that had nearly cost him his career, he realized that the controversy had taught him and his congregation valuable lessons about the difference between faith as comfort and faith as challenge. The synagogue was smaller now, but it was also more committed to social justice work, having established a formal committee to help domestic violence victims and other vulnerable people in their community. Sarah Martinez had successfully completed her GED and was working as a medical assistant while pursuing nursing school, sending occasional updates to the rabbi and his wife about her progress. She had obtained a divorce and was building a new life free from violence, though the emotional scars of her marriage would take years to fully heal. Several families who had left during the controversy had quietly returned, realizing that their anger had been rooted more in fear of change than in genuine disagreement with the rabbi's actions. Harold Weinstein never returned, but he had been replaced by younger board members who shared Rabbi Goldstein's vision of the synagogue as an active force for justice, rather than merely a social institution. The local media attention had actually brought new members to Temple Beth Shalom, people who were drawn by the rabbi's willingness to risk his career for his principles and who wanted to be part of a religious community that took its moral obligations seriously. Rabbi Goldstein's marriage had been strengthened by the crisis, as he and Rachel had discovered reserves of mutual support and shared conviction that they hadn't known existed. Most importantly, the rabbi had learned that moral leadership sometimes required accepting conflict and division rather than seeking the false peace of moral compromise. The controversy had been painful, but it had also clarified what kind of rabbi he wanted to be and what kind of community he wanted to serve. In his Friday night sermons, he often returned to the themes of sanctuary and moral courage, reminding his congregation that their ancestors had been strangers in need of help, and that their obligation to provide such help was not conditional on convenience or comfort. Epilogue. 5 years later. 5 years after the night Sarah Martinez knocked on the synagogue door, Temple Beth Shalom had become known throughout the region as a congregation that actively lived its values. The domestic violence program that had grown out of Sarah's situation had helped dozens of women and men escape abusive relationships, working in partnership with law enforcement and social service agencies to provide comprehensive support. Rabbi Goldstein had been invited to speak at conferences about the role of religious communities in addressing social problems, and his congregation's model had been adopted by synagogues, churches, and mosques across the country. Sarah had graduated from nursing school and was working in the emergency room of a major hospital, where her experience with trauma helped her connect with other victims of violence. She maintained a friendship with Rabbi Goldstein and his family, visiting occasionally to update them on her life and to thank them again for the sanctuary that had made her recovery possible. The synagogue's membership had not only recovered but had grown, attracting people who wanted to be part of a community that was willing to take risks for its principles. Rabbi Goldstein often thought about that night when he had opened the door to find a desperate woman seeking help, and how that single act of compassion had tested and ultimately strengthened both his own faith and his congregation's understanding of what it meant to be a religious community in the modern world.